but I first want to thank you all for being here, and thank the committee that organized this Jornades and all the professors to have invited me here. It is a great honor for me to be here, and I'm really looking forward for the conferences and conversation that will follow this. This is my first time in Barcelona, and I find the city very beautiful for more reason than one of which being, as you can see, this is what my street looked like when I left on Monday. Let me tell you that I'm dreading to go back. I was very interested with the topic of this year's Jornades. The future starts today. Having students realize that they can be agents of social change gives a purpose to their learning of social sciences. Yet how can we help students see the links between past, present, and future? How can we turn them from passive to active citizens? How can we make sure that they develop in class their critical thinking, the tools necessary to be open-minded citizens? My presentation will try to answer these questions through the lens of history education because it is my specialty. And more specifically, I will be looking at it through the learning of a critical historical consciousness, if this is possible. Before I go any further, I want to give you some information on a little bit of background on Canadian history education. As you can see here, we have 10 provinces, and each province has its own Ministry of Education. That means that we have 10 history curriculum or history program. So one for each province. They are all different. So if you're a student in Montreal or a student in Toronto, you don't learn the same history. You might learn similar things, but not necessarily at the same time or in the same way. Even though we have very different history curricula, there is a common background to all of this. And ever since the 1980s, the aim of the history courses and social sciences in general in Canada is no longer the memorization of a unique patriotic narrative, but rather the development of a form of critical thinking specific to history, namely what we call historical thinking. The development of historical thinking presupposes that students are familiar with the concepts and methods necessary to interpret the past, and that they will be able to transfer these concepts and methods to become agents of change in their own society. So there is a big proximity between learning historical thinking and becoming active citizens. In fact, when you look at the current Quebec program of history, it clearly stipulates that historical thinking refines the critical mind of the pupil and develops an intellectual rigor, thus providing them with the tools necessary for deliberation on contemporary problem and social participation. Thus, it's understood that being able to think historically is a key factor in the development of an open-minded and active citizen. However, many empirical studies showed that historical thinking is rarely the focus in the Canadian classroom. So there's a big difference between the program, the official thing, and what's really going on into our classrooms. The teachers still prefer to rely on a more transmissive teaching of historical thinking, of history, based on memorization of facts and events. This situation is by no means linked to teachers being lazy. On the contrary, that's not the problem. It's mostly linked to the difficulties that students experience when developing their historical thinking skill, One of these difficulties being the one of transferring the concept of historical thinking from the specific field of history to the analysis of a current social issue. So it's mostly because the teachers feel that it's too hard for the students to think historically, and thus they prefer to go back to a more traditional method. Another problem, which I won't really talk about today, is the problem of assessment, which is also another problem that prevents teachers from fully going into historical thinking. They really like the ideas, but the constraint of the classroom sometimes is more problematic. Well, faced with these problems of students having difficulty to transfer their knowledge, some history educators have turned to the concept of historical consciousness as a possible solution. Indeed, historical consciousness has the advantage of clarifying the relationship between past and present events, thus enabling students to understand why they are taught to think historically. It makes more sense, and how this method can then be adopted to analyze current events. Through historical consciousness, narratives are no longer just amalgams of dates and events or characters. They become a key to understanding today's society. However, historical consciousness remains a polysemic concept, and its use in the history and social study classroom is still up for debate. Can historical consciousness be considered as a form of thought that can foster both the development of a critical thinking in students and their ability to become agents of social change? If so, how should we promote its implementation in the classroom? How are we supposed to do this? Great ideas, but practically, what are we supposed to do? So just before we go any further, I would like to give you a brief definition of what is historical consciousness so we all know what we're talking about. So historical consciousness, I'm still an historian, so I'll go back into doing a little bit of history here. Historical consciousness is originally a Germanic concept, so me learning German has something to do with this. And at its root, it finds its root in the work of philosophers such as Hegel and Dilthey, but it's really with the writing of Gadamer in 1963 that the term really seems to emerge in the literature. Gadamer described history as the discipline that allows people to make sense of time and concepts such as present and past. A completely objective interpretation of the past is seen as impossible because one must always consider one's own subjectivity. Thus, according to Gadamer, a person will demonstrate historical consciousness when he tries to better understand how the past influences its present and how both past and present will in turn influence its future. This past, present, future triangle is found in most definitions of historical consciousness given by modern writers. For example, the Quebecer Charland describes historical consciousness as part of the present and invites action in the future. A vision of things that is taken over and detailed by French Tutu Guillon, who proposes it historical consciousness conjugates not only past and present, but past and future. To be aware that what society, the social man, was, allows people to judge, to choose, to give meaning, and thereby to imagine possible future. So we really see here this triad of always going from past, present, and future. The same definition can be found in the German Rusen, which emphasizes in the particular role of historical consciousness in understanding the links that unite the past with the present and with the future. Modern writers therefore consider, just like Gadamer, that historical consciousness is a form of historical behavior, that is to say, a behavior that pushes the human or the person to interpret the past, to understand the present, and to consider the future. Apart this three-part nature of historical consciousness, which seems to be the only point on which modern authors agree, we can then find several models of what historical consciousness is, and some of those models really contradict one another. So basically, apart from that, the literature is a big mess. So what are we supposed to do with this? So if we look at this, some authors such as Rosen will see circle the consciousness develop from the available narrative that are found in society. According to this model, historical consciousness, as opposed to historical thinking, is not considered a tool for interpreting the past, but rather how a person would use the available narrative found in his or her society to understand the present and envision the future. In contrast, some authors, such as Straub and Ciències, consider that historical consciousness is more a simple appropriation of available historical interpretation. Historical consciousness becomes a process of interpretation in the same way as historical thinking. According to them, historical consciousness is the state in which we think history, so it's a bigger state. These different definition with these different definition underlie a great debate. Can historical consciousness be critical? Can it be a critical consciousness? Or is it simply us looking at the different collective memories and using the narrative, for example, in our classroom? Is the choice of narrative that compose historical consciousness based on criteria and consideration of the historical context, or more simply on the popular narrative found in society? The ambiguity as to a possible critical historical consciousness come from its relationship that it seems to maintain with both memory and historical thinking. Because if we agree that narrative is the form by which historical consciousness becomes operational, it remains to be seen whether it succeeds in discriminating the narrative that composes it. So we really have this problem. Can it be critical or not? So just to help you here, so the link between memory, historical thinking, and historical consciousness, how can we make sense of this and how can it become useful for a classroom? So if history is a construction or a reconstruction that can feed on memory and or oppose it, what about historical consciousness? For some authors, such as the Quebecer Laville, there is a closeness between the concept of historical consciousness and memory in the sense that historical consciousness would draw from memory the narrative that allows it to make sense of the past, present, and possible future. If it is the more or less critical character of the narrative sustained by memory that poses a problem. Indeed, societies share what we called a so-called collective memory, that is composed of a collection of stories that are more or less accurate interpretation of the past, but that are most commonly shared by a group of people. For example, there's a study in Quebec by historian Jocelyn Letourneau and his collaborator that have helped us better understand the collective memory of Quebec students. So what Jocelyn did was to ask students to write down an answer to this simple question: tell me the story of Canada as you remember it. You have 45 minutes. And so students were very panicked and tried to write down a narrative. And then they analyzed these narratives to see what were the main events that would be more commonly found through them. And so what we see here is that the Quebec students, they share an homogeneous narrative of Quebec history, where the Battle of the Plain of Abraham, this is when the French lost the colony to the English, has a very, very important place. It's very central, but it's been, like, the event is 250 years old. It's still seen as the most important event in the entire story. Then, if we continue looking at those narratives, we see that students seem to forget the entire British period of Canadian history, a period that still lasts from 1763 to 1867. I personally call this collective amnesia the British blur, because it gets very blurry in students' mind. And then the story picks up in the 1960s when things starts to get more interesting for many reasons. And so we have this very homogeneous history or understanding of history in our students. What's problematic here is that with these kind of stories, as Todorov will point out, is that memory can be both sacralized or trivialized, resulting in a form of paralysis, where any critical examination of the histories supported by a community becomes impossible. So you're not able to go back to these stories and critique them, they're seen as universal truths. To avoid this, the narrative included in one collective memories should, in theory, be reinterpreted many times using rigorous methodology. Yet, some authors see a bigger proximity between historical thinking and historical consciousness rather than historical consciousness and memory. For example, Peter Ciències indicates that historical consciousness is at the intersection between public memory, citizenship, and history education. So it englobes all of these things. The teaching of history, which involved the development of historical thinking, developed then a critical historical awareness among students. Historical thinking here becomes one of the elements that make up historical consciousness, just like memory, and a sense of citizenship. However, historical consciousness, which feeds both on the past to understand the present and envision the future, is not de facto a form of critical thinking, in that does not necessarily question the accuracy of the narrative it used to give meanings to time. Yet I'll argue here that students can train their historical consciousness to question the accuracy of the narrative they use. As a result, historical consciousness can both base its understanding of time on the fixed narrative associated with a form of memory abuse, as Todorov puts it, or on critical narratives. So both ways, as you can see here from my graph, are possible. So historical consciousness can go either to non-critical narrative based in memory or towards the critical narrative they can build using historical thinking. Yeah? And so in this case, we can say that historical consciousness does not always distinguish the righteous from the arbitrary or the absolute from the relative. How then, in the course of the teaching of history, can one promote a critical historical consciousness rather than a more or less closed consciousness based solely on collective memory? So how are we making sure that students use their historical consciousness in a more critical way? Yeah? Well, at this point, our hypothesis is that including historical consciousness in the classroom should benefit the teaching of history and promote both the development of a critical thinking and civic agency. My hypothesis presupposes that historical consciousness can make the difference between narrative coming from memory and those examined through the lens of historical thinking. If we believe that historical consciousness can become a form of critical thinking, we still need to understand how to do it. Fortunately, several people have thought about this before us, and we have many models that are available in the literature. But I need to respect my time limit and also your patience and the fact that there's coffee and chocolate after this. And so I will just quickly present 5 models of historical consciousness, which I find very interesting. My slide here somewhat encapsulate all 5 models into a mixed model, which I'll come through. So just the first model is the model of hermeneutic philosophy. Sorry, the English there is not very good. The first model that we will approach comes from this philosophy, particularly I'll go back to the theory of Gadamer and Lukács. which Gadamer will define historical consciousness as the privilege of modern man to be fully aware of the historicity of all present and the relativity of all opinion. This leads Lucas to propose that historical consciousness can be both conscious and unconscious, as we see here, critical, non-critical, or critical. This cohabitation is possible, according to Gadamer, because humans are part of time or history, and because of this, it's impossible for them to detach themselves completely from time. It is possible to see here two levels of historical consciousness emerge. At the first level, a person will accept all the narrative that seems correct to interpret the past, to understand the present, and to envisage the future. At this level of historical consciousness remains unconscious and non-critical. At the second level, which is a critical one, a person becomes aware of his own subjectivity and the influence of his present in the way he or she questions and understands the past. In this case, historical consciousness becomes a critical consciousness. In short, for historical consciousness to become historical, the individual must realize that history is an interpretation of the past and not the fixed truth. And in doing so, his historical consciousness will move away from collective memory and prefer an epistemological understanding of the discipline that aim to determine what is reasonable to believe. So we're hoping that students understanding that this understanding move from non-critical to critical. I'll move on then to Freire's model. It's this is our second model, and it's a model where he describes a dynamic evolution of consciousness. Freire here does not speak precisely about historical consciousness, but the model is still interesting because it examined the role of education on its development. For Freire, the evolution of consciousness is directly influenced by education and by schooling. That said, basically, in other words, teachers are very important. And he sees, Freire proposed that at birth, the child would have what he calls a semi-intransitive consciousness governed by his primary need: eating, drinking, sleeping. It's when he grows up that he will develop what we call a transitive naive consciousness, where he tends to seek easy explanations, sometimes magical ones, rather than to question reality and to go to the bottom of things. If you have small children, for example, 5 or 6 years old, you'll see how they rather tend to find simple explanation to complex problems because they don't go to the bottom of things. For them to move away from this, it's really the nature of the teaching they will receive that will influence their later development of historical consciousness. If students receive an education based on the development of critical thinking, they can develop a critical transitive consciousness. This will enable them to become a critical, open-minded, and active citizen. If, on the contrary, they go through a process of massification and propaganda, students will develop a fanaticized consciousness in which people basically only becomes objects. Even if Freire is not especially dealing with historical consciousness, he highlights the crucial role of school and education in the building of a critical consciousness. It's thus very tempting for me to see a relationship between the development of a critical historical consciousness and how history is taught in the classroom. So there would be a big factor for the historical consciousness to move from being non-critical to critical would be how history is taught in the classroom. This brings me to Ciències' model, in which we find in his writing that he questions both the construction of a critical historical consciousness and its role in the learning of history. For Ciències, historical consciousness is a state at this crossroad, as I said, of memory, citizenship, and history education. That is, memory citizenship and historical education would be the three spheres that are influenced by historical consciousness. For example, a young person would use his historical consciousness when he questions the narrative found in his collectivity or society, when he's trying to building his own identity in time, or when he faces a citizenship problem. Historical consciousness allows, according to Ciències, students to understand the limits related to historical evidence, understand the distance between the present and the past, and understand the immensity and complexity of the past. So through historical consciousness, students are able to be more aware of the complexity of the discipline of history. So in other words, historical consciousness would serve to assess our understanding of the past. To achieve this, students must develop, according to Ciències, the concept of historical thinking that are 6 in number in his model. I don't know if you're familiar with this model of historical thinking, separated in six concepts, but in Canada, it's the most popular one. It's the one we find in most history curriculum across the different provinces. So the 6 concepts are historical evidence, so all the sources, historical significance, why do we learn what we're learning, why one event is seen as more important than the other one, continuity and change, how things change or stay similar from past to present, cause and consequences, which is a normal one, historical perspective, that is you can see it 2 ways, either looking at an event through different perspectives, for example, a woman's perspective, a First Nation Indian perspective, Black Canadian perspective, or again, looking back at the past and trying to understand why people acted as they did. And finally, we have the 6th concept, which is the ethical judgment. This is where we go from past to present, trying to look at ourselves today and see if the action of the past are something we would like to repeat or we should learn from, and what should we learn from them, and how are we different from the people of the past. According to Ciències, historical consciousness become critical when it's based on the 6 concepts of historical thinking. So basically for Ciències, the critical nature of historical consciousness clearly depends on students being able to think historically. Although the model of Ciències allow an interesting link between historical thinking and historical consciousness, it does not take into account all the non-critical part of it. And it appears in Ciències that historical consciousness is naturally critical since it emerges from the work of historical thinking. But this model somewhat forgets the link of historical consciousness with memory. So how can we see then historical consciousness move from a non-critical aspect to a more critical aspect? And this is where Ruzin's model provides a partial answer to these questions. Ruzin's model, as you can see here, is this long green arrow. This one is based on 2 theoretical presuppositions. The first is that historical consciousness is composed of narratives, and the second is that what's changed from one individual to another is the scope of the narrative when trying to understand the present. Thus, Ruzin proposed a taxonomy divided into 4 levels of progression. These levels are called, as you can see here, traditional, exemplary, critical, and genetic. And and this scale would allow, at least in theory, to identify a level of historical consciousness in students. If we bring this taxonomy back to the field of history teaching, students will demonstrate a traditional historical awareness when they see the past as unchangeable, and therefore being as an inheritance to be preserved. So we cannot change the past, it's our inheritance, we must keep it that way, we must always teach it in the same way, if not we're going to lose something. This is the traditional. And then at the exemplary level, students will understand the past as an example of the present. The distance between the past and the present is thus non-existent, since the past is repeated in the present. It's a very circular way. There were war in the past, there will be war today, and there will be wars tomorrow. It's a very circular understanding of what's going on. At the critical level, students view the past as completely foreign and unrelated to their present. Not here that the term critical refers to a form of negative judgment and not what we're talking about critical thinking. The fourth and the last level is the best one, of course. It's the genetic stage, which, according to Rosen, is the culmination of the development of historical consciousness. The past is perceived as an interpretation that originates from the present and is therefore biased. However, the use of the past to understand the present is still possible because the subjectivity is taken into account. So this taxonomy, at the very least, offers the possibility of identifying the evolution of critical historical consciousness in students. So knowing where your students are, you would be able to say, okay, he's there in his understanding of history. However, I've put this model to the test because when I was looking at all these, I felt it was very difficult to choose one model that would be more accurate than another. It seems on the contrary that a mixed model is the best way to apprehend the concept. Thus, like Gadamer and Lucas, historical consciousness for me can be understood as being non-critical and critical. It would be non-critical when there is an unquestioned acceptance of all narrative to understand past, present, and future, and critical when there is an awareness of the limits and subjectivities of the narratives. School, by extension, the teaching of history, would play a central role in the development of a critical historical consciousness, and thus the learning of history through the sixth concept of historical thinking would help us to achieve this. And we could use the different stages of Rosen's to assess our students. As I said, I put this model to the test in an empirical study with 148 secondary 5 students. They're aged between 16 and 17. In the French school in Quebec, in the province of Quebec. What I did is that I asked students to answer a problem from their present, so from today, but whose origin was found in the past. For example, I asked them about the cause of poverty in the sub-Saharan Africa. So I asked them, why is there poverty in the world? So it's a problem that is very current, but if you want to fully explain it, mostly if you're looking at the African countries, you need to go back in the past. There were 2 meetings with the students. The first time just to record an initial narrative. So I asked the question without any information. They had to write something down. And then a second time I would meet the student again. They had to write a second narrative, but after we had worked together with historical sources. So we had this activity they needed to complete. When we had our data, we tried to organize the student's narrative according to Rosen's, and this didn't work. Because Rosen's here in his level always considered that the person will mention the past in his narrative. They will always go back. Curiously enough, students, when asked such a question, don't always go back to the past, and some of them are quite happy to stay in the present. Thus, most students didn't fit into the categories that Rosen have proposed. And because of this, we decided to build our own model of our own taxonomy. And so, for example, when I said that students would stay in the present, I had this, they would tell me that African countries are poor because of drought and climate change. It's basically too hot to grow anything. I felt that was a bit rich, when it comes from kids living in a country that freezes over 6 months of every year. And though we basically went with them to like try and get them to think more critically about all these things. So in our own model of historical consciousness, we went and we had a really careful reading of the narrative provided by the students, and we made a categorization based on whether or not the participant took the past into account when building his or her narrative. So it's with this second categorization that it was possible to specify whether or not the students managed to develop a critical historical consciousness after our activity. Yeah? So here we can see all the 4 levels. The first 2 levels, the primary and immediate level, are associated with a form of non-critical historical consciousness because the past and present links are never taken into account and the students do not justify his idea or opinion. The first level is named primary historical consciousness, and it regroups the students who have trouble explaining the phenomenon of poverty. I'll just show it to you here. I have some clear example. And the second level is named immediate, and it brings together the students who propose a narrative focusing only on present events. So I'll just give you what students would somewhat answer me. So at the primary level, when I say what are the causes of poverty in the world, then the students just go and say, this is really unfortunate, we must help them, yet I don't know what to do, send money. And so they don't know what to answer, they just find it, they have a very emotional response to the problem, but they don't want to dig further. At the immediate level, they'll go on and say, well, poverty was caused by colonialism, so they see it in the past, but this has nothing to do with poverty today, so there's a big gap. But there's nothing we can do. Poverty will always be present in our societies. So you see here that students, when they are at the immediate level, they can see what's going on in the past, but they really see no links between past and present. In fact, when I would show them the historical documents, they really didn't understand why we were doing this. This seemed very odd for them. And the other thing is that when you look at becoming an active citizen, at the immediate level, the students don't seem to be able to take action because the situation is just always there and there's nothing we can do. So if we're looking for active participant in our society, if we stay at the immediate level, we might have a problem. And then when we look then here at the composite level, this is where we shift from a non-critical to a more critical historical consciousness. We see here that the students will say to us, I can see how the cause of poverty in the past affects poverty today. There should be a simple solution to this, but it's not easy to find. And here we have the students that are seeing that there is some link, but their narrative are somewhat still awkward, and they're very unsure of what to do. It seems that they're still learning, yeah? And at the 4th level, which is the narrative level, this will regroup the students that are more capable of seeing the links between past and present. And they also have a more nuanced understanding of things. And they'll say to us things like, I can see how the phenomenon of poverty has evolved from past to present. I think we must take into account the multiple causes of poverty before proposing a solution. It's a complex matter. And so students are not afraid of proposing solutions or taking action, but there are more nuanced and thoughtful solution than just at the primary level that the first simplistic solution is the one we should be taking. It's very far from the emotional response. And so what we saw here is that when we were looking through those narratives, we were looking to see if we could see sign of historical thinking, to see if there's an adequation between the historical consciousness becoming more and more critical, and the ability of students to think historically. And what we saw is that effectively we can see a link between both of them. And so here, I'm sorry for the long text, I just felt that it might help the translator as well. So when we look at the primary historical consciousness, we see that they have a big difficulty in formulating a narrative. For example, in our study, uh, when they had to explain the concept whose origin is in the past but still present today, uh, either most of them just answered us, I don't know, or they were just, as I said, indignant in the injustice of the situation. They would just say, as I just told you, this is terrible, a terrible situation. These poor people, we must do something. But when I asked what action should be taken, they simply answered, I don't know. At this level, it is difficult for students to make connection between past and present, and they did not seem to be able to use the narrative form to express their ideas. They struggled to identify cause and consequences of an event, and this affected their ability to produce a causal narrative. When asked to question the historical sources we were working with, they did not link the past event with the current one. As I said, they seemed not to understand why we were working with historical sources. In addition, students, from being unaware of the links between present and past, they did not seem to have developed the intellectual skills associated with historical thinking. The epistemological understanding of history as a discipline was also limited, if not absent. Since students struggled to look to the past to try to better understand their present, they couldn't see why history was useful at all. These are the kids that are usually very bored at the back of your classroom. This all results, in our opinion, on an inability to fully understand the historicity of social problems and move away from an emotive response. Note that I don't think that emotion should be avoided. We are not robots, but acting solely on them might be problematic, mostly because when asked students who are very emotive with these situations what we should be doing, they couldn't answer us. At the immediate level, the main characteristic of the students is that they perceive the past and the present as two different entities. These students, like those at the primary stage, seem to have a hard time getting away from their present, and they tend to use elements drawn from their everyday life to interpret the past. They also base their assumption on common sense more than on historical knowledge. Consequently, their interpretation are studied with anachronism. So they were like providing us with a lot of narratives that were full of anachronism. They struggle to understand that the values and customs of society might have changed over time. So what was true as a custom or value of today should also be true in the past. While half the students at that level managed to construct a narrative that evoked both the present and the past, a detailed analysis showed us that these students limit themselves to making basically comparison between past and present, and they see no continuity between them. This difficulty to observe how things change tends to suggest that students are at the beginning of their learning of historical thinking. The concept of continuity and change, as well as those of cause and consequences, seem to have been not developed at all by the students. Moreover, they never use historical perspective when analyzing a source. The only perspective they use is their own. And in regard to students at the immediate level, these are the ones that mostly mention history classes and film as equally good source of information to better understand the past. So a movie is as good as their history teacher to better understand what's going on, which is a little bit stressful. These students failed to assess the accuracy and the appropriativeness of the source of the historical source they use to understand their society. They seem to entertain the idea that history is the telling of a unique and truthful story of the past. The interpretative character of the discipline is completely unknown to them. Therefore, immediate students would base their understanding of history on their understanding of the present and judge the relevance, accuracy, and complexity of past events, not on critical thinking, but a moral judgment rooted in the norm and values of their society of today. Let's see. Now moving to the composite level, this one brings together students who seem to be in the process of constructing a critical historical consciousness. Indeed, these students have a certain form of narrative abilities, and we see it improve, of course, through time. And they can, but not always, make connections between past and present. And these connections are usually the simplistic ones, the ones that are quite simple to make. So for example, in Quebec, in New France, when it was the French colony, there was a lot of guys. They were mostly male settlers. And at some point, France decided that the population was not growing fast enough, so they sent over what we call les filles du roi, the daughter of the king, which were basically women wanting another life and were sent with a boat to Quebec, to New France, to marry the settlers that were already there. Basically, they had the contract, they had a year to marry, or if not, they would have to go back to France. And thus what happened, well, something fairly normal happened. The population grew when those French women came. Fairly easy. And this is a simplistic link between cause and consequences that students at the composite level are able to see, because it's very A, B, C, A becomes B, A and B will equal C, something like that. So this is what we're seeing. And what we're seeing is also that these students are able to use the concept of anteriority and posteriority, and they can use the causal narrative in a certain way. So they seem to be in the development of their competency to establish causality and to detect the element of continuity and change, but without being able to always explain it in the full detail. The data also highlights that a high number of composite level participants still base their assumption on common sense. In addition, few students at this level question the interpretation given to certain facts of the past. Indeed, they often consider information from film or television as trustworthy as other sources, and they do not have the reflex to question the accuracy of the information presented to them. So when they look at the sources, they never ask, where did this evidence come from, who wrote it? And so they're still lacking into those behavior that we're expecting students to have when confronting an historical source. So a student at the composite stage is in the process, as we can say, of learning historical thinking. His understanding of the discipline is still changing. At this level, students know and apply different historical thinking concepts. They analyze the source, they'll identify cause and consequences, and they'll generally see the simple links between past and present. However, these techniques are put to the service of getting the right answer, where history, resolutely a school discipline, remain a unique and truthful story, a form of openness to the plurality of perspective and narrative is detected, but the pupils do not manage to see these things on their own. They really need their teacher at this moment. So in short, students at the composite level seem to lack the necessary critical distance to take into account the complexity of the past and its relationship to the present and future. This leads us to believe that students at this stage are still in the middle of learning historical thinking, and they are in the process of developing their critical historical consciousness. And finally, our fourth stage, which was by the end, about 30% of our participants, is the narrative historical consciousness, which will bring together students who seem to have built a form of critical historical consciousness. These students systematically, when we ask them, use a causal narrative. That's like how they will express themselves. And they will try to explain to us the situation linking past and present. So, for example, the question of poverty in African countries is explained from the concept of colonialism or imperialism and its evolution through time. So we're really seeing it as an evolution. Students are able to understand how these concepts will change or stay the same, and they are able to identify the cause and the consequences of their transformation. Moreover, they seem to be familiar with all the concept of historical thinking. They question the perspective of the different actors of the present and argue on the importance of events over another. They do not hesitate to use historical sources, but unlike, I have 10 minutes, this is fine. Okay, excellent. They do not hesitate to use historical sources. Actually, they really like using them, but unlike the other events, the narrative students are the only one that will question the accuracy of these things or the relevance or the perspective of the author. So they say, oh, this author, he might be more with this perspective, so I need to read my source in such a way. The other one would just read the source and take like looking for information. This ability to question evidence and their interpretation that comes from it seems to foster in these few students an understanding of history as an interpretation rather than understanding history as a true and unchangeable narrative. Students at the narrative stage seem to be sufficiently equipped to interpret historical sources, but unlike the students in the other levels, their narrative competency and their epistemological understanding of history provides the space that's necessary for them to develop a critical historical consciousness. Therefore, reaching a form of critical historical consciousness would be possible only when students understand the epistemology of the discipline, have the tool to interpret the past, which means historical thinking, and are able to see the links between past and present in the form of the narrative, which we would call a narrative competency. When students are at this level and are brought to propose a solution to the phenomenon of poverty, the answer is much more nuanced and the solutions offered are a lot more realistic, and we're able to work with them. So, when we look at all these things, how can we use these different levels into the classroom? Well, the research has showed us that right now, the teaching of history is often limited to the memorization of declarative knowledge. And this situation is partly caused by the difficulty that students have in developing their historical thinking skills. We have pointed out in other writing that historical thinking only makes sense when it's developed with historical consciousness. If not, it's just only tools. It's basically just a method. And if the student doesn't know why you should be applying this method, it makes no sense to him to do so. So basically, using historical consciousness gives a good purpose to the use of historical thinking, and this view is reinforced by recent research done by Gibson and Wilschutz, which highlight the importance of learning narrative skills, particularly the ability to understand the concept of temporality in order to develop a big picture understanding of the past. As a result, while the development of a critical historical consciousness is still a laudable effort in the history courses, we still need to move even further than that so that we should not limit ourselves to the learning of an analytical technique, often only associated with historical thinking, but even accept a bigger or larger methodology in the history classroom. So as Rosen points out, the form of historical consciousness is that of the narrative. Narrative are also produced by historians following a fine and critical analysis of available evidence. It is therefore logical that one of the skills that students should be able to develop in our history classroom is the one of being able to interpret, construct, and deconstruct the available narrative. Yet this skill seems to have been put aside in recent years because it's often, unfortunately, associated with the memorization of a static narrative. However, what I'm proposing here is that working with historical consciousness, students can start to think why these narratives are being built. Do I agree with the narrative that's provided with me? If not, how can I change it? Is it the only way of thinking of the past? And by doing so, by building their own narrative, but also deconstructing the narrative that are already there, students can use historical thinking in a context that makes sense. And use also the concept of temporality, and that will encompass also the one of anteriority and posteriority that should be also mastered. So you see, finally, students must be able to differentiate a historical narrative from other form of stories. Sometimes we see this confusion. I don't know if it's the same in Spanish, but in French, histoire as stories and history as the discipline is the same word. And so it's thus very important that students understand history as a problem, as a question, because the origin of any narrative is a question asked by an historian. So to construct or deconstruct a critical and nuanced historical narrative, one must turn to the concept of historical thinking. This is for something we should be also doing, yeah? It is thus through the frequent use in the classroom of the concept of historical thinking that students begin to take a critical step back from the various interpretations of the past they faced. This learning allows them to take into account the context of the period, to assess the significance of the available interpretation, and to consider the epistemological and ethical aspect of any historical question. This critical mind frame, according to our data, would be only possible when the students have both an understanding of the epistemology of the historical discipline and feel at ease when using the concept of historical thinking. Thus, the level of historical consciousness can provide teachers with a better understanding of where their students are in the learning of history and what difficulties they still have. And so it's a way of helping them because we know better how their brain is working. So to conclude, if we want students to act in the present, we need to go further and lead the students to consider the past as an infinitely vast and history as a focused, critical, and evolutionary interpretation of a past that we're questioning. By helping students deal with this complexity, we can help them understand the complexity of current event. Some will say that this will cause uncertainty and a lack of social cohesion, but we believe that instead it will release the students from the constraint of a single and unique truth, and it will promote the openness and freedom of reflection which they need to assess to become critical thinkers. And I think right now, if we look at the news, we can see that we are badly in need of critical thinkers. And so what do I have here in the future? And just to finish with these two research projects, so building on all of this, a colleague and I, Lindsay Gibson, we built a timeline card, and we are helping students with these timeline construct and deconstruct narratives in the classroom, asking them to assess progress and decline. It's not a card game to learn dates and events. It's really a card game to understand time temporality, and how the cause and the consequences between the different events. The other project we're having right now, working with primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, pedagogical counselors, and even historians, is we're working on a possible progression of historical thinking from grade 3 all the way up to grade 4 in the high school level. So to think about this possible progression is also to think about the assessments, so helping teachers know what to expect at students' different ages, and thus help them in the assessment of historical thinking. Well, I hope this conference was interesting to you, and thank you again for hosting me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.